more often than not, in those Old Testament prophetic books, where the people of God's care for the poor, for the needy, for the Gentiles, for the other, for the stranger. He says, when you do that, it's like a fragrant offering coming up. And there's imagery of like God inhaling in and being pleased by the obedience of his people to serve those in need.
Welcome to Practicing the Practices. This is an experiential podcast where we not only want to help you learn about the way of Jesus, we want to help you practice the way of Jesus in your everyday life.
Welcome to Practicing the Practices. I'm here with Casey, and always we are discussing how we can integrate our faith, our discipleship to Jesus into our everyday life. How do we go beyond just belief to actually living it out and practicing the way of Jesus? And last episode, we introduced a series of conversations around a life of service. That is 101, central to what it means to follow Jesus. And Casey, our emphasis in our last episode was on like the spiritual necessity. It was kind of philosophical, it was theological, and we're really urging people to consider service because, man, this is the way of Jesus. And today we want to talk about how not only is service the way of Jesus, but because Jesus is for our good, that service is for our good. That a life of service can actually bring us joy, spiritual benefits, psychological benefits, that there is something in it for us.
So before we start, Brad, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment
and
say, is it okay for us to want benefits? As we're talking about what are the spiritual benefits, what are the emotional and psychological benefits of service? Like, is it even service if I'm getting a benefit from it? Because when I grew up in my church, you were supposed to like hate service. It was supposed to be really hard. And that's how you knew that. And it was kind of nothing, you weren't getting anything out of it. And that's kind of how you knew you were really walking the straight and narrow, picking up your cross. So is it okay for us to get benefits from this or want that?
Well, what you're kind of stepping into is actually a great debate in the philosophies, particularly around altruism and this idea that, good for others, service, generosity should be done with no self-serving intentions at all. So if I might put on my amateur philosopher hat, Casey, I think there is a vision in the ancients, in the New Testament, where Jesus would say, absolutely, serving others can also be to bring you great joy. There is a very kind of skewed, false idea that God doesn't really have this plan for happiness for us. There's even this kind of quote that you hear in, God cares more about your holiness than your happiness. And I think one of the reasons we have such a distorted view of God is we apply our anthropological limitations onto God. Okay, big word alert. We take our kind of human limitations, the fact that you and I are not infinite, that Casey, you are 50% this, 30% this, 60% that, and we apply that thinking to God, but God is infinite in every way. And so God, in this case, cares very much about your holiness, Casey, that you're set apart, that you're his disciple, that you follow his way, that you resemble him. And in doing so, you serve, because that's what Jesus did. He didn't come to, be served. He came to serve, give his life a ransom for many. And at the same time, God is gracious and benevolent. God wants good in your life, not in kind of the goofy, weird prosperity gospel way where you become God, but I actually do believe that God wants you to flourish. God wants you to experience joy and happiness. He is not a miser for happiness. And I think God actually designed the world from the Garden of Eden. Service begins there, right? God designed Adam and Eve to have a purpose. There might not be a more kind of evil, apathetic, mean thing for God to do in creation than to make Adam and Eve, give them this incredible world and no purpose in it. We hear stories all the time of the uber wealthy. The young 20-something billionaire, like the guy who created Minecraft, and all of a sudden he finds himself depressed and miserable because he's got billions of dollars and he can go to Ibiza anytime he wants, but he feels empty because he doesn't have a life that's devoted to a purpose greater than himself. It's just about, self-gratification, right? So if God puts Adam and Eve in the garden and doesn't give them a purpose, which the purpose he gave them was service, keep the garden, cultivate it, get out there, work the ground, that gave them a meaningful role to play, right? So God is for your happiness. God has designed service not only for his glory, not only for the good of his neighbor, but also for your good and my good. So I would say, I think theologically, we make a greater case, but for the sake of time, that it is actually okay for you to benefit emotionally, spiritually, psychologically from serving.
Well, that is good to know. And honestly, I think my relationship with God changed so much for the better when I realized that life with him didn't need to be miserable. It wasn't like the more miserable you were, the more devoted you were as a Christian. Now, life will have suffering and hard things, but what you just said about God is not against us living a happy, joyful, fulfilled life. In fact, Jesus said he came so that we could have life to the fullest.
Yeah.
And Jesus, we say many times on this podcast, lived the most abundant life of any human that's ever walked the earth. And he wasn't a rich man and he didn't have a lot of luxury in his life, but he lived in an abundant way. And so as we serve like he did, we will live in abundance too. Another benefit, Brad, that I think that comes from serving is just the knowledge that when we serve others, we actually are serving Jesus himself.
Yes.
Jesus says in Matthew 25, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." And then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go and visit you?" And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." So right now, if Jesus walked in this room where we're doing our podcast and was like, "Hey guys, can you get me a Coke Zero? Can you give me somewhere to sit?" We would be like falling over ourselves, being like, "No, Brad, get out of the way. I'm going to go get the Coke Zero for Jesus," right? I mean, if he really walked in here, we wouldn't even think twice about making him comfortable, taking care of him, getting him whatever he needs. You want me to go drive to Panera and get you a sandwich? I'll do that. And so just the knowledge for me, especially when I'm maybe called to serve someone that's difficult. I know Mother Teresa did this, serving in her mission where she took care of sick and dying people, that she looked at them as if they were Christ himself.
Yes.
And it not only motivates our service, but it's to me a benefit of serving, knowing that I was able to actually serve Jesus.
There's this Old Testament imagery that comes to mind, and it's a little foreign to us because maybe a few of you out there do, but most of us aren't burning incense, but you might have a candle.
I actually burn incense like every day, but I'm a total hippie.
Yeah, maybe essential oils, right? So there's this fragrance that's pleasing, and in the Old Testament, God oftentimes tells his people, like, hey, more than pious worship, when you obey me, in the context of obedience, more often than not, in those Old Testament prophetic books, were about the people of God's care for the poor, for the needy, for the Gentiles, for the other, for the stranger. He says, when you do that, it's like a fragrant offering coming up And there's imagery of like God inhaling in and being pleased by the obedience of his people to serve those in needs. So absolutely, it is a way to bring joy to God.
That's beautiful imagery. So as you think, Brad, of what other spiritual benefits we gain from service, what comes to your mind?
So here are a couple of things. Not only do we bring joy to God, but we bring joy to those around us. There's almost this way in which we can lift the spirits of our community, of our city, through Christ-driven service. There's this great narrative in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 8. The disciples are serving. They're casting out spirits. Like there is this totally different way of living that's going on. In an ancient Greco-Roman society, from which we have borrowed many of our philosophies of self first, comes this group of people who are being selfless. And here is a direct quote from the ancient writers, that there was great joy in that city. Like that there was this sense in the community of being uplifted. So one of the great benefits of service is that we can become this like joy distributor to those around us. But I think there's also something in it for us in a very appropriate way. Like there's a way to be obtusely prideful, arrogant, and just about like your own agenda. But there is, I think, a very appropriate way of just coming alive and feeling in tune with Jesus, feeling in tune with our brothers and sisters when we are serving in our sweet spot, when we are taking that which God has given us, maybe a spiritual gift, maybe a talent, and we are leveraging it for the good of others. Man, it fills us up with a sense of meaning and purpose. And again, back to the garden, I think that's God's design. God wants you to be connected to him, and he is doing something. He is bringing about his kingdom, and he is inviting us to like hold the tools with him, to work on the kingdom with him, like to build the kingdom with him. And all of a sudden, like we don't have to wake up tomorrow and be like, man, what is my life for? What is my life? Like there are so many wandering, aimless people who are like, man, what does this even mean? And you and I, those who follow the way of Jesus and who understand kind of the kingdom way of Jesus, we should never have to wake up and wonder that, right? Like God is going to put somebody in front of me, and I can serve them today, and that's purpose. I am now in the story of God. So I think there is great spiritual satisfaction. And I think one of the things, Casey, that's worth pointing out here, that science has come along and has agreed with the scriptures and has identified some mental and physiological benefits to service, which I think you and I would say are also spiritual. But in a kind of a more material sense, there's a lot of other things that service does for our benefit.
Yeah, the world at large agrees that when you serve, when you volunteer, when you put other people first, it actually has so many psychological and mental health benefits. So this truth that we know is true from the Bible is actually readily agreed upon in our world. And I think, at one point you said, everyone loves this. Everyone loves this practice, because if you engage in it, even if you're not doing it for the Lord, there's a truth in the Bible that this does something to your soul that we can feel.
God has designed it for your good.
Right. So some of the mental health benefits of service, volunteering include stress reduction. Serving others actually increases feelings of pleasure and levels of dopamine in your brain. And so this release in dopamine helps to reduce feelings of stress and increase feelings of relaxation. Stress, as we know, negatively impacts our immune system. So reducing stress can actually boost your immune system's functioning. So stress reduction, better health in your body. Also increased sense of community and belonging. We feel that in our church when we serve, and we can feel that in the world when we serve. When you're given the chance to impact someone else's life, you're likely going to experience a greater sense of connection and purpose within your own life, just like you were just talking about, Brad. Another benefit that is recognized in the mental health community is increased optimism. You just have a better outlook on life. You're able to kind of see the world with a better perspective when you're engaging in a community that's helping other people instead of just focused on all that's wrong in the world, because we know there's a lot wrong in the world. Another benefit of service is a new sense of perspective. So it's really easy for us in our life to hyper-focus, Brad, on like all the little hard things of our days. But I found, and so has research found, that when you actually serve a community that's less fortunate than yourself, it can actually help you to zoom out a little bit and realize, oh, wow, this little thing that was causing me so much stress today, or that I was so upset about, is actually really not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
And that really increases our gratitude when we can zoom out and get a better sense of perspective. We can go, oh, wow, I'm actually so blessed. Just the fact that I have food on the table, just the fact that I have a bed to sleep in at night.
Yeah.
And I'm not worried about where my next meal is going to come from. And my kids are able to go to school. All of these things that we have are really a lot clearer when we're serving a community that doesn't have some of those things.
Absolutely.
And finally, increased happiness is another benefit of service. And I mean, Brad talked about this a little bit. That's something, happiness is a word that can be kind of a no-no in Christianity sometimes. Like, well, we're not trying to be happy. But there is a sense of gladness, a deep gladness, a happiness, a joy when we are serving other people. And it's just undeniable.
Literally, Jesus in the Beatitudes says, blessed are you, happy are you. And this life of service to others is kind of a central theme there, right? So the moral of the story here is, in very practical terms, here's how God's economy works, is the more you feed yourself for yourself, the more spiritually your soul begins to react and feel like your body when you've ate a bunch of fast food or too much ice cream or too much cake. Good for a moment, and then you just feel, ugh. But the more you begin to get in tune with God's plan, with God's kingdom work, and His calling in your life, which is to live for His glory and the good of your neighbor, and you start leveraging your gift and stewarding the opportunities He's given you, His supernatural joy, this deep, satisfying sense of purpose begins to take root. You lay your head on your pillow at night, and instead of having kind of a fast food soul, you begin to experience the satisfaction of your soul because you're abiding with Christ in His presence has now extended towards you being the incarnational presence of Christ in the lives of others through service.
Beautifully said, Brad. So last episode, we gave you an opportunity to reflect on the quote by Frederick Buechner. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. And we gave you a moment to really think through, what is that place where you feel deep gladness and satisfaction? And where in your world might there be a hunger for that? So, Brad, today we're going to take that a step further. What are we going to challenge our listeners to do today as part of their practice?
We want you to open up your imagination. And I want you to think about who, where, and when. Who might God call you to serve? Is it your children? Is it your local elementary school? Is it some of the residents of the assisted living facility just down the road? Is it members of a marginalized group of people in your city? Is it your neighbor right across the street who's maybe been injured or is elderly and needs someone to clean up the leaves in their yard this fall? Who is it that God has put in your life? Maybe it's like an enemy. Maybe it's someone who there's been this battle of jealousy. Like, who is it? I don't know who it is. Let the Spirit of God awaken your imagination to the who God is calling you to serve. Where are you going to do this at? Like, what's the place? Put it in your mind. Let the Lord kind of stir you. Where are you going to go? And then when are you going to do it? Make a plan. Make a plan. The best of intentions, right? What's the old saying? The road to hell is paved with the best of intentions. If we just listen and talk about service and be like, oh, that's good, but we don't actually engage it, we miss the point. Now, maybe you're engaged in faithful service right now, but you've just grown a bit weary. Maybe the Lord is inviting you to experience Him in your service in a deeper way and to recognize the small things you do that maybe no one even notices, He does, and it's part of His kingdom work. And so how might He be calling you to use your gift, what He's given you? Maybe you're a great teacher and communicator. Maybe you have a nurturing spirit in you. Maybe today you email your church's kids ministry coordinator and you say, hey, I'd love to help get involved in kids ministry at your church. Maybe you are great at sports and you were an awesome basketball player and could be a volunteer coach and help some 8 or 9-year-olds find joy in their life through youth basketball. Like, allow your imagination to run wild. That's the piece that Casey is talking about, this sense of gladness. What is it that you already enjoy, and how might you leverage that and put it on display for God's glory? What's the one small step you could take this week to participate in God's kingdom through a life of service? Well, that's another episode of Practicing the Practices. Casey, thanks for leading the way. Until next time, grace and peace.